good web network is something that we're looking to build up over the next year, to build and develop a community around the question of how can we build a better web, and how can we be designing and supporting technologies which are not just compatible with, but promoting things we care about: democratic values, human rights, and online digital rights. So I'm really excited that you're all here tonight. Last time, for those of you who do for the conversation tonight. So we want to be talking about how is good tech policy made? What is tech policy? Is tech policy even a thing, or is it all just policy these days? Obviously at Demos we start from the premise that the voices of the people most affected should always be at the heart of the policy making process. And it's interesting to see how that can apply to tech policy too. So we have a wonderful panel tonight. I'll introduce them in a second, but we're wanting this to be more of a kind of conversation than a panel. So we're going to be alternating between panel contributions and contributions to the audience. So don't wait 20 minutes to think of a question. You should also, Sahdya will be handing out pieces of paper and pens, because we're going to ask our panel to kick us off with a sentence each on what they want to change about tech policy making, what we should prioritize better tech policy making. And I would invite you all to, over the course of the evening, write your own submissions, and Sahdya will be collecting them up, and we'll review them at the end to see if we have achieved magically consensus. And if we haven't, we will have something to talk about next time. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel. So we have James Plunkett, the Executive Director at Citizens Advice and author of Penn State. We've got Sahdya Darr, who's the Migrant Digital Justice Program Manager at the Open Rights Group. We've got Calista, Lead Public Affairs for Tech at Hill+Knowlton Strategies, and Mark Bunting, who is the Director of Online Safety Policy at Ofcom. So we're going to kick off with our one-sentence statements, and I'm going to come to Mark first.
Right.
For your one sentence, please.
Okay, my one sentence is in French, I'm afraid, at the risk of starting on a very pretentious note. It's not that pretentious. So my sentence is, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. That's what you get for that.
Thank you very much. Casey.
In short, I think we need feminist tech policy.
Fabulous. Sahdya.
2 words, decolonize tech.
Thank you very much. And James.
They're so crisp. Mine's terrible. Mine was, well, I'm going to have to reword it. Mine was something like, there's no such thing as tech policy, there's only policy in technological times.
Nice.
Something like that.
Okay.
Shorter version of that.
So we've got, I'm going to get the French the wrong way around now. Plus ça change, we've got feminist policy, we've got decolonizing tech, and we've got no such thing as tech policy. Do we have any immediate audience reactions? To anyone disagree very strongly with any of those statements? I mean, I would say anyone agree very strongly, but I feel like a lot of them are very sensible. Yes?
Well, on the last one, James, if now is technological time, haven't we always been living in technological times?
Excellent.
Good question.
Something to come back
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
What is technology? I feel like that could be a one very quickly. So have a think about your sentences, aiming for as crisp and concise as our wonderful panel. And I'd like to kick off with the first provocation from James.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I don't know if this is a hugely unhelpful point to make in a technology policy event, but I was going to argue essentially along those lines that you sort of opened with, of it no longer really makes sense or is particularly useful to think about technology policy, at least as a kind of silo, if you like, similar to housing policy, welfare policy, technology policy, which is often, I think, the sort of mental model that we apply to tech debates. The argument, I think, is basically that tech has become, and I'll say a bit more maybe about what I mean by that, but tech has become so pervasive that it's now essentially an environmental factor, and it's just a context in which we set all of the policy, and so we should stop thinking about technology policy per se and think instead about policy making in a high-tech age, a digital age, maybe a digital age is a better phrase than a technological age. There's this slightly cliched phrase which goes something along the lines of having a chief digital officer is now like having a chief electricity officer. The point being that, again, you get to a certain point in these technological revolutions and the technology itself becomes so pervasive. It is just the new conditions in which you work, and you kind of, at that point, you transition away from having sort of specialists that are chief digital officers, technology policy people, and you move towards just everyone having to have that sort of base level of understanding of the way in which the world now works. I thought I'd just touch on sort of three ways in which technology, or maybe digital is a better word, is now so pervasive it sort of sets the conditions for the way we should think about policy. So the first is it is changing what I would call the institutional forms that we use to do policy making. So one of the, I think, most significant insights of some of the early digital work in government over the last 10 years or so, maybe 10 to 15 years now, was that you cannot do good digital government work within the old mindsets of hierarchical whitehall departments. Obviously there's the kind of transition from more waterfall to more agile ways of doing the work, that you need to do things like dramatically devolve power closer to the work itself, so that the teams are far more autonomous in the way they're able to work, and essentially you need to reconceive of the way that the institutions of government function on an operational level in terms of their form, and that is very profound, and it means that essentially the kind of institutions through which we govern, from whitehall departments to organisations, for instance, like the NHS, to the welfare system, need to be reconceived on new lines, and that's a profound thing that goes way beyond sort of DCMS or the sort of what you might consider the sort of technology-oriented bits of government. The second point is around the concepts and categories that we've inherited from a pre-digital age, that many of which just aren't really fit for purpose. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of our biggest kind of pickles that we get into when it comes to technology are often because we're trying to apply these outdated concepts, and the arguments we're having are themselves about outdated concepts. So the kind of most interesting example I find in that area is around the labour market and the gig economy, where we've had this quite sort of argumentative bun fight about Uber drivers and gig economy workers. You know, are they self-employed or are they employed? Big court cases, unions and others kind of arguing this case, and it seems to me pretty obvious that Uber drivers aren't employed. They're also not self-employed. The idea of calling them workers, this kind of grey third category, doesn't work very well either, because really all of those concepts and legal categories are themselves outdated. All of those concepts were invented long before the idea of a platform was a thing that we could imagine. And so in that case, you know, Uber drivers are a new kind of thing. Platform workers are a new kind of thing we haven't had before. And so trying to fit these new kinds of things into these old categories and old legal concepts like employed, self-employed, doesn't work, and we end up having this kind of, I think, frankly, slightly distracting argument that sucks all the oxygen when we should be thinking about how do we define this new thing and what kind of responsibilities and relationships should apply to a platform worker and a new company that builds the platform that they're working on. Another brief example that's quite similar, I think, is when we're talking about data, we often argue about ownership. When we talk about who owns the data, I don't know that you can own data. I don't know if you should be able to own data. It just seems to me a kind of an attempt to apply the concept of ownership from an industrial age to a new, potentially sort of digital phenomenon, data. And ownership doesn't seem to me a particularly helpful concept when it comes to debates about data. There's much more helpful ideas like stewardship and access and so on. So again, it's just a kind of category that is, I think, outdated and makes it actually harder to have sensible conversations about tech. And the third set of sort of things that are outdated are, I guess I'd call paradigms or mental models or worldviews. I think there's all these examples across public policy where the basic paradigm itself is outdated, and so the problem runs really deep. So the example I'd give there is in consumer policy and regulatory policy, which maybe we'll talk a bit more about later. I think a lot of the old models of prescriptive regulation are really struggling to regulate a digital age, given just the sheer pace of change, the complexity of issues like algorithmic decision making and AI. And what we're seeing in that case, emerging consumer policy is quite a different paradigm, built around, broadly speaking, the idea of more outcome-based regulation or more principles-based regulation, where regulators like the FCA and others are thinking about doing their work in quite fundamentally different ways. So that it's not about prescribing certain specific sort of banned list of behaviours, but it's about setting some broad principles, because that's the only way you can regulate the digital age, which is moving so quickly that you just can't keep up with the way markets are working through that kind of old prescriptive model of regulation. So those are all examples of, I think, sort of just the pervasiveness and the significance of the change that's underway, where we need really quite fundamentally to rethink some of the kind of basic building blocks in public policy. And I think it seems to me that to sort of bucket that off as technology policy, or sort of leave that up to the sort of experts in a certain regulator or a DCS, DCMS, or technology teams, is to sort of underappreciate just how profound that kind of reform agenda really is. So I think tech policy isn't like housing policy, welfare policy. It's not a vertical; it's a horizontal. And we need to move to that kind of approach and that kind of way of thinking about it.
Thank you. And I want to pick on this idea of it is a horizontal, but we're treating it as a vertical. Where do you see the barriers to people acknowledging it's a horizontal? To you mentioned everyone having to have this sort of basic level of understanding, which perhaps doesn't exist currently.
No.
So how do we flip the policy to horribly mangle a metaphor?
Yeah, no, I think it's a big deal. I'm always struck that it represents. This is reflected in the way that events work. Even, for example, so you go to a great event like this, and there's loads of folk in the room that understand tech and can have really thoughtful conversations about it. And then you'll go to an event on housing policy or welfare policy. Quite often there'll be no mention of technology or the profound changes that are underway. And as you say, the kind of the level of understanding really for folk who are outside of what you can consider technology policy is quite alarmingly low. And amongst politicians, I have to say, it's extraordinary how little it's mentioned. It sometimes seems to me it's a bit like being in about 1850 and no one talking about the Industrial Revolution, no one talking about what's going on outside. You're sort of standing outside and the factories are transforming the world, and people are sort of having these kind of slightly prosaic kind of arguments about housing policy or how we tweak the taper rate of universal credit. And so I don't know, it's quite profound. I mean, it reminds me of there's a very good read lecture from the 60s by C.P. Snow where he talked about the really problematic understanding of science at that time in books, and the need to kind of just elevate the understanding of politicians and civil servants, just the significance of science and the changes that were underway at that time. And I sort of think we have to do something similar now in terms of it shouldn't be okay to not understand digital tech if you're an MP or certainly a minister. That shouldn't be a sort of thing you can laugh off. It should be useful to hold folk to account and say you need to treat it seriously and up your level of understanding.
I'd be interested in a quick straw poll. Is folks in the audience who would describe themselves as working in tech policy? Okay, so we've got about 50-50. So we're on our way towards systemic change.
We so come to the right event.
Do you have any thoughts or comments from the audience? Yes.
Yes, I have a thought about it. I know it's interesting when one was talking about the various systems, the way in which they use tech hardware policy. And I think it's actually based on culture change. And when we view tech policy in isolation, without understanding what the cultural underpinnings are, which is what we have now, then our policy is not going to be reflective. And it was interesting when the Uber case was mentioned. Now, the Uber system came from Africa. So it worked within that culture. There was nothing. And then it was transported to the West, a different culture. So the perceptions of the systems that it fitted in was not as it was in, say, Africa. So when we don't understand I'm going to use this word, intersection. And when I say intersectional experiences, what about intersectionality? What I mean is the intersection of experiences. We can no longer, from my point of view, live in and divide things in silos. We need to connect the different silos, understand how cultural change and what the cultural variables are within those silos in order to uplift everything together. That's just a point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other?
I actually think using the phrasing like tech policy is somewhat problematic given how overarching it is. Like technology can apply from anything like drones and autonomous weapons, drones of dual use, through to a whole plethora of uses of software ranging from uses in the legal system through to healthcare. The fact that technology is so pervasive, the fact that not only is it effectively system by system, but it doesn't touch upon whether it's firm consumer. So tech policy is used both in the frame when it comes to regulating big tech, but then also it comes in the same frame in education policy. So I think what really is an umbrella concept that looks at, I guess as you were saying, each and every aspect of policy, narrowly and somewhat arbitrarily defining a subset of that tech policy means really you end up missing the rest of the
John.
So a theme that came up in a conversation that we were having yesterday was the sort of absence of an overarching vision of where we should be in 10 years, 15 years. And so it's very hard to take the first step if you don't know where you're going to be on the 1000th step. I know you touched on this in your book, but it does feel like our government, the timelines that policymakers think on just aren't equipped for this kind of fundamental, significant change. I'd like to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I mean, just to link together a few of those points, I agree that, I think we got to the point in the revolution, for want of a better word, when I think there comes a point when using the word tech, at first using the word digital or using the word technology is quite helpful. And I think we've got to the point where it is a bit of a hindrance. In my day job as function, we did have we had a chief digital officer, and when they left, we chose to drop the word digital, and because we just found it was becoming a hindrance, and we replaced it with the word design, because that's really what we were talking about, was better design services, and the technology was an afterthought really, and becoming a bit of a distraction. And the moment you said the word digital, it took people down strange alleyways, conversations about tech that weren't really the conversations we were trying to have. So I do agree with that. That's really about culture, as you said. Yeah, I think the kind of how do you bust out of the incrementalism is really interesting. And I don't know. I feel like this will be harder this time around because I do think we're quite deeply entrenched in a sort of in the incrementalist, very technocratic, very incrementalist sort of policy making mindset or something that's been pretty dominant since the 90s, and it's reflected in things like dominance of economics and discipline in public policy, sort of lack of imagination and creativity in a lot of public policy debate. It's very rare that there's a philosopher in the room. Okay, some philosophers are here. They're always outnumbered by the economists. And there's almost a sense that the kind of, I don't know, the technocrats have slightly the trump card. And I think it's very interesting that the kind of emergence, the growing salience of debates about imagination, social imagination, the new Jeff Morgan book, which I really recommend, which is built around the question, how do we get better at imagining the kind of society we want to live in 2 or 3 generations time? And what kind of mechanisms and methodologies can you use to be better at imagining, to your point, where are we trying to get to over, say, a 20 or 30 year period? With great uncertainty, no doubt, and like you need to do that kind of work with humility, but unless we're at least asking that question, we're locked in this kind of, how do we tweak the paper rate for universal credit type, sort of the war of the technocrats, that kind of highly incrementalist debate, which I can't see how you get there through 100 times incremental steps. that's some sort of guiding light, some sort of North Star.
Sahdya, I wonder if I could bring you in at this point, perhaps to talk about what our guiding star should be for how we can, well, I was going to say how we can make tech policy better, but based on the last few minutes, how we can make policy better.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I've been thinking about this question of how we can make tech policy better, and I think that, I mean, you can't answer that question without looking at policy making in general. And I guess like when I speak now, I'm going to like bring in not just my professional experience, but also my personal experience. So I've been working at Open Rights Group, a UK digital rights campaigning organisation since September 2020. So I would say I'm fairly new to the digital rights space. And I think there are several observations that I've made. Firstly, we hear a lot now in the NGO sector about centering lived experience. And I was actually just at a residential that was organised by a number of funders from earlier this week. And we were talking about how centering lived experience and, you know, other buzzwords that are, you know, that have started to be used. I think when I think about lived experience and tech policy and lived experience and digital rights, it's often seen as the last part. So you do the thinking, and then the communities are the ones that you go to at the end to ask them what they think. When in actual fact, it should be that in that process, when we start the process, communities should be there from the very beginning, and they should be co-designing these policies. I find it really interesting in my work. I work closely with the migrants' rights sector, and I mean, there's a whole host of issues going on. We have GPS tagging of migrants on bail. We have data sharing between Home Office, between government departments going on that has been deemed to be unlawful. We have the use of mobile fingerprint scanners that were piloted, I'd like to say tested in West Yorkshire, and have been rolled out across the country. And I think the communities are often left out of these discussions, and they're integral to them. I can't really see how you can, when you're making policy, these communities are left out. But I just want to quickly go back to something that actually I wanted to say in the beginning. When I was thinking about how I would answer this question, my first thought was, well, who are our policymakers? And for me, as a woman of colour coming into the work I do, it was very evidently a certain demographic that dominated policy making, and I'm starting to see this change, but it's not happening. The change is not happening fast enough, and this affects how we think about an issue, how we come to an issue, and so I think it goes beyond just communities. We really need to think about, you know, the people who are hired into these kinds of into policy making roles. And also think about the kind of like expertise and knowledge that we need in these roles as well, because often it's you know, we might hire someone because they have good connections to people in Parliament or whatever other reason, but I think that really stifles like creativity as well when you're thinking about solutions. If you tend to have the same thinking, and yeah, what we do need different thinking. I think what I also wanted to say as well, I wanted to echo a point made previously. We've also noticed in our work, or we've also seen a real lack of understanding of tech amongst politicians, and really difficult. It's been very, very difficult for Open Rights Group to engage with politicians on this issue. There are some that we've come across who are curious. So for example, last year, Open Rights Group, we analysed the data in New Direction proposals, and we held an event with Stephen Timms MP about how the government proposals with regard to data would affect migrants specifically, and he was particularly interested, but you need more than one MP who's interested. I think what I would like to see, and this doesn't just go for politicians but across the board, is more knowledge sharing going on about digital rights and tech, and also when we look at who is at the table when we're having these discussions. I mean, I say who's at the table, but in my role, my colleague and I have made a conscious effort to basically go out and ask if we can be in the spaces that communities are in. So rather than asking people to just come to the events that we hold, is it okay for us to come to where you are and listen to how you're being affected by data sharing and tech in your communities? And I think that's really important. I think sometimes some of the terminology we use when we talk about data and tech is it excludes people. When we're talking to communities, quite often they're not using, for example, the same terminology that technologists would be using. And so therefore I think it's really important that we need to have a combination of going out to communities, but also when we do bring people around the table, I would like to see more of not just communities present, but also when we bring academics to the table, whose scholarship are we engaging with? That's really important as well. I think one of the examples, we've been working lately a lot on, I'm sure you all know, Twitter, what's been going on with Twitter. And I found it really, really interesting. Someone working in an organization someone working in the digital rights organization, how we've approached that issue specifically. And there's been a lot of people moving over to Mastodon, the alternative, and to Twitter. And I just happen to be, but I do spend a bit too much time on Twitter. I just happen to be on Twitter, and I started reading comments by, comments that were being made by people who are part of the Black Twitter community, people who are part of disability Twitter. And it's really interesting seeing how people who dominate tech policy discourse and digital, whatever you want to call it, how they engage when thoughts that are very different to their own come up. And I think we need to work on that in policy making as well, that when we hear things that are probably things that we we're not familiar with, or we really need to listen and engage and understand, because people's lived realities are very different. I think tech has come to be centered in a lot of discussions, and we forget that, yes, some of this technology is bad, but also when we take the technology away, a lot of these issues are still going to remain in society. So I would like to also see us moving away from just completely centering tech. And I think I'm just going to finish on this. Another thing I'd like to say is that, I do agree with the previous speaker that working in migration with the Nationality and Borders Act now, we saw data and tech weaved through that, and it's being weaved through many. It wasn't just the Nationality and Borders bill, but also the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts bill. So yeah, we can't be looking at these issues in silos. They're all connected.
Thanks so much. And I think that there's a lot of echoes of the need for more kind of creativity and imagination, and also a very good prompt, I think, to the thinking about how we, even things like how we curate events like this, and how we talk about these things, and what language we use, and what platforms we're engaging in. Much food for thought, at which I would like to ask if people have comments. Yes.
Well, sorry, but this discussion is very interesting to me, and I'm a member of Women in Identity that talks about identity in tech, and it's very interesting that the work, the intersectional work we do, both in Britain and worldwide. But forgive me, but I've got an economics training and I like to deal with facts. I concur with what the speaker said. You know, in the tech sector, there's great discrimination against gender, ethnicity, age, and neurodiversity, which are four very big groups, which included in policy could help move things along. Now let me just give you figures. Although DME population is only 15% in STEM, 40% complain of discrimination. Women, it's 36%, and Asian and Southeast Asian, 31%. So over a third of the people who could be contributing to policy making and the impact on them affects the justice system, the education system, and the health system, all of which places a large strain on our resources. So, as the lady said, we need an intersectional approach. This is not the time to talk about bells and whistles, who said this, who said that. We need to get down to the grassroots and connect tech with them, listen to what they're saying, because it has an impact on the various silos, and we need to understand how that connects. And again, it comes down to changing culture, which cannot be incremental now, especially in the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the audience? And just before we're able to just type us a quick summary of what's said for Sahdya, because I know that I think our microphone is struggling a little bit. Apologies, Sahdya. Any other comments?
I was curious about the right people, as both an economist and a computer scientist. I find a remarkable lack of computer scientists involved in tech policy making. And when you're looking at things like GPT-3 and GPT-4 and the actual rate of progress in these systems, the overwhelming majority of those officially technically educated are either in academia or most often in industry. And when it comes to regulating and formulating policy in other areas of government, it's deemed sensible to have the right experts. So I wonder why when it comes to tech policy, the overwhelming majority of voices are not necessarily technical experts when it comes to
Thank you.
Not a comment, more of a question. I hope that's okay. Who's doing this well? We've talked about the need to have horizontal policy. We've talked about the need to bring other voices into the conversation. Governmental, non-governmental organisations. Who is our shining star here? And is there one?
Excellent question, which I'm going to come back to Sahdya just to summarise for you. We had a comment about the need for an intersectional approach and the need to tackle discrimination. A comment about the lack of involvement of technical experts, often in tech policy making, and a question: who is doing this well? Who is our model example, if there are any? We hope there are.
Yeah, that would be really depressing if there wasn't. Might as well just give up now. So when it comes to examples, I think some of the groups I'd like to actually highlight their work are a lot of grassroots groups that we've worked with. So for example, in September, I was at the European Digital Rights First Colour of Surveillance conference held in the Netherlands, and basically brought together lots of NGOs and grassroots groups from across Europe to the Netherlands to talk about not just the issues that were being faced, but how they were being fought. And I actually found it really inspiring because, for example, in the UK, we have the Racial Justice Network based in West Yorkshire. And with I believe it's a 3-year campaign that they've been fighting called Stop the Scan. They were able to stop the use of the mobile fingerprint scanners in West Yorkshire. But when you look at how that came about, it was just brilliant. It was, you know, working with academics from Queen Mary University. It was bringing in people with tech expertise, digital rights organizations, also lawyers as well. So there was a real mix of people who have been involved in that work to get that win, but led by the Racial Justice Network. And then you have campaigns going on at the moment. Actually, I'll just point to another success that we've seen. There was data sharing going on between the Home Office and HMRC that was targeting highly skilled migrants. And the highly skilled migrants created a campaign group and were able, with I believe it was Foxglove, another digital rights campaigning organization, and the Migrants' Rights Network were able to fight back against that. So there are some positive, there are examples, and I actually think these examples are like a testament to like grassroots, and how actually if we have we need to have a range of people involved. I'm a big fan of this lawyer and activist called Deepa I, who's based in the US, and she says that when we talk about social justice, there are so many roles to play to achieve change. And you know, one person doesn't always just have one role. They may have different roles and play them at different times. And I think we've seen with Racial Justice Network, with the highly skilled migrants group, that it takes grassroots, for me, is where I've seen that resistance, but also working together with others.
Thank you so much, and yes, very nice to have examples that we can look to for ways we can be improving practice. I'd like to come up to Mark at this point to talk about your experience of being in the midst of the policymaking process, and what good looks like, and what are your sort of hopes and ambitions for tech policymaking.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, I feel a bit obliged to be the representative of technocracy here tonight. So I'll try to do a bit of that, but be provocative at the same time. It's doesn't come naturally to technocrats to be provocative, but I'll give it a shot. So on the sort of things staying the same part of my sentence, I mean, I thought James really summarised that very well. I think it's true that by and large the processes of policy making, the mindset of policymakers, the institutions within which policymakers work have not changed very much, certainly in my sort of adult lifetime, which is quite a lot longer than some of your adult lifetimes, I think. So, and that is clearly causing pressures and dysfunctionality in all sorts of areas. And again, I thought James's examples were very clear. I think there are some aspects of the cultural approach and institutional approach of classic policy making that we should be quite careful about not throwing out with the bathwater. In particular, and I'm not saying that modern governments always live up to these values, but the values about careful consideration of evidence before action, clear theories of harm, a forensic assessment of whether your intervention can make any difference to the problem at hand. Those are important, or even the ability to specify clearly what the problem is that you're dealing with. Those are important disciplines which take time and require observation of the environment for a sustained period before you commit to action. And those principles, I think, are particularly important when the environment is changing very dynamically, because you may find that the problem you think you've got now is not the same problem that you have in a year's time. And if you intervene on day one in a very heavy-handed way, you may find that you're solving the wrong problem, or that you're creating more problems through the unintended consequences of action, which no longer has the desired effect. So I would argue for a bit of caution in tech policy, not rushing to try to address problems before they're well understood, and proportionate interventions when they're required. Having said all of that, I think we do need more agility in policy making, and in my area, in regulatory policy in particular. The way that I think about that is it's sort of not so much about the long-range planning, and this is a very regulatory perspective. As a regulator, I would be very cautious about trying to forecast where markets were heading over a 5 or a 10 or a 15-year horizon, because that's very, very difficult to do. And the one thing that you're going to do is almost certainly get it wrong. So I would urge for a policy-making approach which is based on clear values and a sense of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, again, as James was saying, but broadly defined, and then the ability to adapt your interventions sort of in flight. So, you know, the ideal model, I think, is that you take action, you continually observe whether it seems to be achieving the outcomes that you intended, and if it's not, you iterate it rapidly. And that's not a very sort of classical regulatory approach, but I think that's one of the changes that we need to see. The final thing that we want to preserve, and again speaking as a regulator, is clarity about the boundaries of government and parliament and the regulator. And sometimes, I mean, we see it, I think, in my area, in the online safety bill, there is risk when regulators have too much discretion about how to act, because in the end, regulators should be accountable to government and to parliament, who are exercising a democratic mandate and have said in legislation what they want the regulator to do. And a regulator which has too much freedom to act risks getting that wrong. Now, having said all those things, that's partly justification for saying what I think needs to be different about the way that we do tech policy and that we do regulation. And for me, sort of going to go back to what James was saying about, you know, is there a tech policy vertical or is there a tech policy horizontal? I think there is a kind of tech policy horizontal, and at the heart of it is a different set of relationships between the regulator and the companies that the regulator is overseeing. We're in a world now where, and this is exactly what the online safety bill does, in an environment where it's very hard for public bodies to act directively or prescriptively to require services to do certain things. You know, it would be completely impractical for me to turn up to Facebook and say, right, you know, we want you to take down these 20 billion items of content that have been posted today, but leave these 40 billion there. We have to establish the framework within which we want services to operate. We have to tell them what objectives we want them to achieve. And then we have to leave them a great deal of discretion about the ways in which they achieve those outcomes. And the job of the regulator is really a supervisory role, which is to ensure that you have oversight and effective accountability of companies for the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And again, that is a shift. I mean, again, you described this quite well, I thought James. You know, Ofcom's old sort of modus operandi would have been to go to broadcasters and say, well, you have to produce so many hours of news content every year, or you have to produce so many programs from this part of the country, or you know, whatever it might be. And as I say, I don't think that works for these very rapidly evolving and sort of large-scale issues that we're dealing with in the context of online safety. So you need a different institution for that. You know, you need an institution which is probably smaller, which has the understanding of industry to go to firms and say, look, you know, we want you to tell us what you're going to do about this problem, online terrorism, hate speech, whatever it might be. And when they say what they're going to do, you have to be wise enough and well informed enough to understand whether what they're telling you is an appropriate response to the problem that they're dealing with. So you need tech expertise, you need that computer science expertise, you need experts in the way that harms affect communities, and very much agreed with what Sahdya said about that. And you also need data analysts and expertise in the information that you're getting from services. Now, that is all quite alien to regulators, to be honest. And it is something at Ofcom that we're trying to do. The final thing I'll say, I think, is the process of defining those relationships with companies is itself complex and time-consuming and difficult. You can't just sort of turn up to Google or Facebook and say, right, okay, you know, tell us what you're doing about hate speech and we'll run our rule over it, then, mark you out of 10 and send you on your way. And there's going to be years of work for these organisations trying to peel back the sort of layers of obscurity that they've put in place, so that we can really understand the effectiveness of what they're doing. But I think that is the job, and it's a different kind of job to the kind of job that regulators would have historically done. But that I think is what we need to do. So yeah, I'll stop there. I think.
Thank you. I think the point you're making is really interesting about how the kind of big challenge, I guess, of the next few years, many years, how we can really bring communities, as Sahdya was saying, into these conversations, into when we're working at, maybe not giving the tech companies a tick or a cross, but trying to unpick the obscurity, how we can draw on the kind of different kinds of expertise and the lived reality of people who it's affecting. Polly?
I was fascinated by what you said about a values-based approach to regulation and policy making. What are the values that you've identified, but also what are the ones you've rejected? You said we're not going to be led by that.
Well, so this is one of those things that I think you have to let governments and parliaments define rather than regulators have too much discretion. And the values that are embedded in the online safety bill are, they're not very explicit, but you have to sort of, try to extract them from the 200 pages of legalese. I think there are two things really. I think there are a set of quite specific things about, action on particular areas of harm. And the bill is quite clear about what it calls priority offences that it wants companies to act on. And they are about protection of children, they're about hate speech, they're about online terrorism, they're about online child protection and prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. So there's those kind of values. But then there's a set of values which are more about the ways in which companies operate. And for me, that would be about transparency and accountability, fairness, openness, redress. And again, those values are embedded in the bill, but and sensitivity to risk. Perhaps more than anything else, that's what the online safety bill is trying to inculcate, is a systematic and anticipatory approach to management of risk within services, which many of them have on the privacy and data side already, partly for reasons of regulation. But on the online safety side, they're not embedded in quite the same way in all companies, even the biggest companies. So that sort of responsiveness to risk and a willingness to moderate commercial ambition with recognition of risk. I'm not quite sure that's a value, but I think that's the sort of heart of the bill's about.
Any other thoughts?
The question more than a thought, but would you see the role of international coordination between regulatory regimes given the nature, global nature of the large tech companies and aligning values or wherever else regulation is led?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it is really important. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Partly it's just a very practical thing, which is that if you're trying to get companies to change, it's no good us sending them one message and the European Commission sending them another, and Singapore is sending them another one, and India is sending them a different one. So we all have different legal frameworks and different specific tools and duties, but we are doing quite a lot to try to create sort of institutional arrangements within which we can start to align on the broad requirements that we're trying to set. And the EU is clearly continues to be a key partner in that. It's not as easy a relationship as it would have been a few years ago, unfortunately. But that's part of it. But it's not just the European Union. As I said, it's a range of jurisdictions. So I think that is really important. But partly important because that's how you get traction on companies. But it's also important because this is a global industry, and we're trying in the end to change the culture of a global industry, and that is going to require global alignment on the sorts of behaviours that we think we want those companies to display. So it is important. We just set up a global, or the sort of fledgling global safety regulators network, which at the moment is us, the Australians, who've been very active in this area for quite a long time, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in not quite so good ways. The Irish, who we have very close relationships with and are important as part of the EU conversation. And then rather randomly Fiji, which I'm not, to be honest, that familiar with Fiji's regulatory environment in this area, but the Australians do a lot of work with them. There's another question somewhere.
Several. We'll go at the back.
Hi. I have a question about transparency. Given your very salient point around making sure that setting ambitions and then measuring compliance with those ambitions in fact. Given that lots of platforms have stewardship, if not ownership, over the data that you'd really need to make those metrics, what do you think is the role of the regulator of governance in making sure that platforms, as an example, aren't marking their own homework on those metrics?
Yeah, so I tried to give a sort of quick answer to that. I think transparency is tremendously important, but transparency is not a sort of absolute good. The question is always transparency of what, and what do you learn through that transparency. And what we've found in talking to companies is that very, very small changes in the metrics that you ask for can reveal completely different things about the nature of the harm. I'll try and think of an example and to make it real, but I'll come back to that. So even there, there's a conversation to be had with industry. The first thing you need to understand is how are they assessing the effectiveness of what they're doing. If they say they have policies to prevent hate speech, how are they measuring whether those policies are actually working? And you start from there, and then you can have a conversation about are those the right metrics? And if they are the right metrics, is there benefit to be had in putting them into the public domain, or allowing researchers greater access to them, or whatever it might be? And that's the conversation that we'll need to have over the next year, 18 months, whatever it is, once the bill passes.
I also have a thought to add, which was pre-submitted by someone who I think is watching online. So hello to Canada. Which was a question: what holds people back from embracing the view that we should have a new public communication service that improves kind of web monetization and free access to digital content? So I guess the question in there is why is more radical change not necessarily on the cards? For which I think I'm going to come to Casey to give your provocation and any thoughts on what's stopping the feminist tech revolution.
I'll go into my thing, and if I don't answer, you can hold me to account at the end. Please do. But yeah, feminist tech policy. To say this in the wonky way, because I am in the offices of a think tank, so you can forgive me for it. It's all about feminist consensus democracy, and what I mean by that is intersectional. And it's not just about adding women, like throwing women into tech and into policy, right? It's about more than that. It's about really thinking through our basic systems and our foundations and democratizing democracy. We all know, like James said at the beginning, that tech has completely changed the way that we live and work and learn, but mostly it's changed the way that we connect with each other. And this has led to a huge problem. And this is that society has changed and it's completely challenged our democratic institutions. We really need to recognize that. And I will give you an example from Sahdya. You referenced the recent Twitter things that are going on. So I'm sure everyone in this room has seen that a couple days ago, Musk has started to call out Apple on what they're doing with the app stores. And so I think if you've read any of the coverage, I just meant to say this again. Speaking of personal capacity, any of my clients are watching right now. So yes, what has happened is that what app stores are doing right now, and what I feel like is they're acting as quasi-regulators. They're acting as our policymakers. They're setting the complete rules of the game. They're saying, what can happen with your data, what protection and privacy is enough protection and privacy, what freedom of expression limits are we going to take before we kick you off? And is that who we want? Do we want a couple tech executives from America, guiding the way that we completely live our lives today? And I guess I have to come on to a solution, and that is, we need to go with this shift, and we need to revisit this foundational, policy making And the way that I would articulate it is we need to really innovate. And the heart of this is really harnessing the radical community building ability of technology. And what we want to do with that is bring more women into tech and policy, bring more of the public into tech and policy, and I'm going to give you 3 things to consider around this, and it very much is echoing my panelists, which doesn't surprise me. We need to base this on values, and I'm willing to go maybe in a slightly different direction than Mark did when I'm talking about these values, and I'm a tech evangelical. So I truly believe that if we do this in the right way, that we can create a better world. And the thing that we need to be focused on is ensuring that we're not replicating the existing inequalities that we have in our society. And that's hard. And that's why some of the other things I'm going to bring out is about democratizing democracy. It's about feminism as the core international relations theory kind of concept that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And this is about community, not geography. And it goes to the where, how are we going to do this policy making that someone else raised? And it's beyond borders. We all know that. We can't be stuck in our UK box anymore. And we're seeing on geopolitical terms, we know that there are going to be divergent regulatory systems. I think there's something really interesting there. How many are there going to be? Well, at least 2, right? Probably more. And which one are we going to fit into, and which ones of us, and how and why? And my 3rd thing is about more radically embracing tech to be able to help us with all this stuff. I mean, I think Ofcom is experimenting with some regulatory sandboxes and being more agile, and I think that's great. And I wanted to come, onto another point, Josh, a little bit to some of the stuff that you asked. One of the really interesting examples that I think is going on is DAOs. So there's a DAO that right now is forming. It's a decentralized autonomous organization. So this is based on blockchain technology to reach a consensus. This is how there's the decision making. So people all over the world, I read about this in a newsletter, have come together around healthcare investment and policy. And what they want to do is they want to drive investment on around some really specific diseases. So they're either patients or their family of patients. And they're making decisions by a new consensus technology from wherever they live in a really democratic way to choose where they do investment and choose on how they want to influence, the policy making specifically of big pharma, but also governments in different places to drive more investment, to drive more research, to drive more innovation, and the issues that that they care about matter to them. And I think that's a great example of where we can be. And so when we're talking about communities, thinking totally into the future, how are we defining who we are, what our values are, who's making our policy is going to be completely different, potentially in quite a recent time, something that is coming up. It's affecting us now. We're living in an environment that we're so far behind. We're so far behind that other people are making decisions for us who they shouldn't be. And I want to put us into a more future-facing, creative, innovative space where we're thinking about what this needs to look like, and we're starting to put in place the building blocks now. And I guess I can close by, re-emphasizing my starting point, which we need to build back policymaking, and we need to build it back feminist.
Strongly agree. Any comments from the audience before we go to that? Don't forget to write down your 1 sentence, because at the end of this round of comments, I will be we'll ask one of my colleagues to collect them all up, and then we will peruse them with Judson insight. So any comments or questions? Yes.
There's a quote attributed to a European politician who said, fake news is bad, but the Ministry of Truth is worse. And whenever I try and think this through, and it's why I steer clear of this issue, I always come back to the point that actually having a bunch of private companies where I can choose to be a Snapchat user or a Twitter user, or I can stop being a Twitter user, is ultimately kind of the best place to be. And I really struggle to conceive of. I look at all the projects that are decentralized and autonomous, and it doesn't solve content moderation, decentralizing your system. So I don't know if is there some vision there for how this could all be done in a way that isn't sort of authoritarian or, you know?
I mean, I guess that's the dream of Web3. Now, whether or not we're going to achieve that, I mean, right, highly unlikely because we have vested interests. We have people who are going to have a head start. But, and I think that's maybe where we need to be looking, right? I think we've almost somewhat lost where we are now. We're so far behind. It needs to be so international and so collaborative. It's not based enough in public opinion. And I mean, obviously, I also watch out for the tyranny of the majority, which is why I use the word feminist in the intersectional, you know, pulling an opinion different ways. And it's a great challenge. And I think we need to be putting in place longer term building blocks for how tech is totally changed. It really, like the way that we can connect and the way that we can choose to live our lives in totally different communities if we want to. I think that in 5 to 10 years, that will come to fruition more, and we're not thinking about that yet. We're not totally prepared for that. We know that we're so far behind, but we're like running to catch up to where we are now. We're not running to catch up to where we're gonna be in 5 years, and we're gonna get there, as Mark referenced. You can always correct me if you think I'm wrong. So it's gonna take, what, 3 years to actually get to grips with what the Twitters and Facebooks and social media sites of today are doing with content moderation. But in 3 years from now, it's gonna be totally different. So that's why I think we have to have a real societal conversation about what these base values are and find new ways of engaging with more people, and specifically ensuring that we're bringing in voices like Sahdya would have spoke about, and rearrange our powers of structure and our powers of decision making completely. And that might, you know, the problem with like a lot of DAOs and decentralized tech right now is it's very exclusionary. Well, so then what are we doing? Like, how are we harnessing like revolutions and innovation? And I guess it's a shout out. I don't have all the answers, but I'd like to, I hope I've provided different food for thought.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Casey, and I think in a way we're sort of all of us saying quite similar things. I mean, I agree with you. You know, the Ministry of Truth is the worst possible outcome here, surely. And just to give you a really micro example of that, you know, where legislation identifies certain things that governments don't want to be on platforms, even there, you know, the idea of a regulator being too specific, particularly about anything which isn't well defined in criminal law, is very problematic. You know, you don't really want a single regulator going around and defining what cyberbullying is, or, you know, because we'll get that wrong. And, you know, so, but I think Casey's right that there is this sort of germ of a different conceptual approach about identifying sort of broader values that we want private organisations to pursue, and then to empower them to choose the ways in which they pursue those values or outcomes, and then to have public bodies which are, you know, overseeing the effectiveness with which they do that. And that's sort of the way that regulation, I think, is heading. It's not quite like regulation of the kind, and it's not, you know, it's not necessarily going to be straightforward. But I do think that there needs to be public oversight in the mix there. And the reason I'm a little bit sceptical about the decentralization movement is because in the end, you know, any open network is vulnerable to abuse by people who want to abuse it. And what we've seen in Web3 over the last year or so is a sort of battle for governance of these decentralized bodies. Yeah. And of course, it's just the same thing all over again that we had, you know, 10 or 20 years ago. So I sort of worry that in the end we're going to find ourselves in the same place with, even in decentralized networks, you have authority manifesting in other ways. So
what levers can we use to help it, and, you know, help it follow our values and do something different? And you know, I am a policy advisor voluntarily for Glitch. So I'm going to say, you know, the online safety bill references women once, twice, max, right? And this is something we've been calling out for as a woman on social media sites. It would benefit me clearly by being the type of person that would speak here to have more of a presence online professionally, but I don't want to, because bad things have happened to me as a result of that. And yet the current legislation does basically nothing for me. And so we're not getting this right now, you know, and we need to. It's really important. It is how we live our lives.
I do think we haven't, I don't know, been imaginative enough about the role of the state in that,
exactly.
right? Because the, you know, we have the sort of, we've inherited, I guess, the model of regulate essentially as being the nature of the relationship, and I don't know, surely we haven't tapped even slightly the potential of these technologies for things for democracy. To your point, I mean, they are fundamentally about the things that these technologies enable are human-to-human communication, deliberation, contact, global relationships, and yet, because the only way in which we've seen that manifest is through the kind of extractive, you know, is through the big platforms, which are the way they are because of the incentive structures around them, right? But we've sort of come to think that that's the only way in which these technologies can manifest, is in these sort of quite unpleasant online environments that end up generating these problems, and then the state steps in to regulate. But I do think I'm quite interested. There's a recent thing that the German government, I don't know if people have seen the sovereign tech, I forget what it's called, sovereign tech fund for tech investment or something. Anyway, it's a way they are investing in open source, in the open source movement, using government money basically to say we think actually there is promise in open source use of these technologies and in people who develop them for reasons other than profit and extraction. And some of those will be Web3 based. And yeah, in the UK we haven't seen any of that kind of idea that one of the government's role might be to sort of fund and facilitate different uses of these technologies for deliberative purposes, democratic purposes. So I don't know, we're going to need to do more than just regulate.
Sahdya, I wonder if I could come back to you for sort of any final reflections while I also ask my colleague Vicky to do a sweep of the room for sentences. Sahdya, over to you.
Yeah, I was just gonna, based on going off what everyone has said for me, I think it just made me think, like, in our work at Open Rights with the migrants' rights sector, we've been trying to like build a community of like knowledge, and I guess what we're trying to do is support our civil society partners to demand like community-driven innovation that's basically centers equity and justice, you know, and centers equity and justice, and really push for, you know, technologists and policymakers who better understand public values and priorities and knowledge.
Thank you, and thank you, Vicky, for these, which will be subject to very speed reading, qualitative analysis. And just before I dive into these, I think, you know, I'm fascinated as, you know, obviously we described this event as being about tech policy, and obviously we've talked about technology, but really I think we've mostly talked about values, and we've mostly talked about power, and who has it, who gets to define what the values are, and I think those are the kind of the two key things I'm going to be taking away from the conversation this evening. So I'm going to go through these and read out a few, maybe show of hands for people if how much we like these. More regulation of how content is amplified. One of you.
Yes, I like that.
A third of UK households struggling to pay their broadband mobile data bills. How can we ensure tech policy is for everyone? Digital inclusion. Defining new harms is great, but we have to fund enforcement.
Yeah.
We've got the global humans affected by Western tech need to feed into Western policy. Back to the points about involving people who are most affected and just relying on the American tech execs. Ex ante legislation or ex post regulation, either works! Exclamation mark.
Oh, very good.
There we go. We've got tech policy needs to think about what it can add to diverse narratives instead of what it can take away. We have a paper aeroplane. Does it have a message? Is it just a paper aeroplane? Just a paper aeroplane.
It's a metaphor itself, isn't it?
AI is talked about as the largest existential risk. how can we talk about tech policy without AI safety? It's true, we haven't dived into we've had a little bit of discussion of Web3, but we haven't even kind of opened the can of worms that is the whole of AI. Although I think a lot of Sahdya's points about kind of use of data in migration and law enforcement, I think is very relevant there.
And Ellen, on that, like somebody that I love is like Tabitha Goldstop, who chairs the AI Council, and obviously she's wrote a book and she talks a lot about innovating in public engagement. And I think those are really crucial points and bring in like how, you know, just in our current society, we can do more of that.
Our next one just says speed.
Yeah,
Yeah, tell us about speed. Well, sorry, my surname is Swift, so perhaps that's living up to my name a bit too much. But I guess the question which has really emerged for me out of this, and I think every speaker has touched on it, is what is the perfect pace of tech policy change? And I'm a journalist, so I like things happen fast. And sometimes it feels like when I'm coming into the policy world, it feels like there's a lot of discussion that goes on and it's hard to actually make action happen. But of course, like these discussions are so important, and discussions around values can go on forever. And I think are really important because, you know, in a way, I kind of wonder, can you make tech policy timeless, or at the very least sustainable through values? Are values a way to anchor that and to make them, you know, the policy kind of live a bit longer than what it can do, because the technologies often evolve so quickly, like we see with Web3 with AI. So that's what I meant by speed of implementation. But you know, and I remember a bit earlier on in the discussion, this idea of incrementality was mentioned, and I wonder if actually that could be viewed as a strength, because, you know, technology is naturally incrementally changing, so perhaps the policy needs to as well. That is what speed meant, sorry. Thank you. And we have another one on a similar theme. The future is coming faster than we think, but our governing institutions still move at the same slow pace. Leave yourself the freedom to iterate fast. Very much to the point.
I should have just written that.
Even if tech policy is just policy, the culture somehow feels different than other policy areas. And this is something I think we've talked about a lot this evening. Is this because the role of the state is more unclear, the speed is different, the hype, or the culture? I can influence the broader digital environments around me in ways that are visible to me. It's another one for user empowerment duties there. And save this one for last because it seems to be a really nice summary of what we've talked about today. Tech policy should be rooted and grounded in ethics, values, in reality via technology and data, in communities and relationships. This means being humble, careful and wise, always listening, learning and responding. Which feels like a very appropriate note to say thank you so much to all of our speakers for coming. Thank you all for coming and being such good sports, engaging with my silly little game. Thank you to people joining us online, and we hope you can stay around for some drinks afterwards. Our next network event will be in January, and if you'd like to join the network, either as an individual or as an organisation, we'd love to talk to you, so come grab me afterwards. Thanks so much, everyone.